I wore sexy panties for my husband. He didn't care, but his friend did. I wasn't trying to provoke anyone. I just wanted my husband to notice me again. Something had been missing between us for a long time, and that night felt like a small attempt to reconnect. He barely looked up. No reaction. No comment. Nothing. What I didn't expect was the shift in the room. A glance held too long. An awkward silence. A presence that suddenly felt different. His friend noticed what my husband ignored. That moment wasn't about desire. It was about realization. About understanding who had stopped seeing me, and who still did. And once I noticed that imbalance, I couldn't unsee it. If this story helps you recognize when you've become invisible in your own marriage, please leave a like and subscribe. There's a particular devastation that comes from realizing you've become invisible to the person who once saw you most clearly. From understanding that you could walk through your own home in lingerie designed to seduce and receive nothing. Not desire, not acknowledgement, not even the basic recognition that you exist as a woman rather than just as functional partner managing household logistics. The night I wore expensive red lace panties and a matching bra under a thin robe, the night I tried one more time to reconnect physically with my husband who'd been distant for months, was the night I learned that sometimes the most painful revelations come not from what happens, but from what doesn't happen, and from the uncomfortable recognition of who does see you when the person who should be looking has stopped paying attention entirely. My name is Claire Watson, and I'm 34 years old. I'd been married to my husband James for 9 years when this incident occurred. 9 years during which we'd built what seemed like a solid partnership. 2 careers in finance, a nice house in the suburbs of Chicago, an active social life with friends and colleagues, all the markers of successful marriage except for one increasingly glaring absence: genuine physical and emotional intimacy. James and I had sex maybe once a month, perfunctory encounters that felt more like marital maintenance than actual desire or connection. We'd stopped having real conversations beyond logistics and surface pleasantries, had evolved into efficient roommates who coordinated schedules and divided household tasks, but who no longer really knew or engaged with each other's internal worlds. I'd tried multiple times over the months leading up to that particular evening to address our disconnect, to talk to James about how distant I felt, to suggest we needed to work on our intimacy and connection. His responses were always variations on being tired from work, stressed about career pressures, assuming things would improve once current projects completed or busy seasons ended. But things never improved. They only became progressively more distant, more disconnected, until I felt like I was living alone despite being married, sharing a house but not actually sharing a life with the man I'd committed to building a future with. The decision to try one more dramatic gesture, to buy expensive lingerie and create an undeniable invitation for physical intimacy, came from a place of desperation mixed with hope. Maybe James wasn't initiating because he thought I wasn't interested. Maybe he needed a clear signal that I wanted him. Maybe seeing me make an obvious effort would remind him of attraction and desire that had gotten buried under routine and stress. So I went to an upscale lingerie boutique, bought a beautiful red lace set that cost more than I'd normally spend on underwear, planned an evening when I'd make myself impossible to ignore. The evening I'd chosen was a Friday when James had invited his friend and colleague Marcus over for drinks after work. Marcus was someone James had known for years, a single guy in his late 30s who was part of James's social circle, someone who came by our house occasionally for casual gatherings. I'd planned to wait until Marcus left, then appear in the lingerie, create a moment that would force James to see me, to respond, to break through the distance that had calcified between us over months of disconnection. What actually happened was a sequence of events I couldn't have predicted, and that would change my understanding of my marriage in ways I couldn't ignore or rationalize away. Marcus arrived around 6, and he and James settled in our living room with beers, talking about work and sports, the usual male bonding conversation that I'd heard hundreds of times before. I was in our bedroom getting ready, had showered and put on the red lingerie, was planning my entrance once Marcus left for the evening. But Marcus's visit extended longer than I'd expected. One beer became several, the conversation continuing past 7 and then past 8, and I realized Marcus probably wasn't leaving anytime soon. I was in my robe in our bedroom, the lingerie underneath, growing increasingly frustrated that my planned seduction was being delayed by Marcus's extended visit. Eventually, I decided I needed to go out to the living room anyway. I couldn't hide in the bedroom all evening, and maybe seeing me in the robe would signal to James that I had plans for later that would motivate him to encourage Marcus to leave. I walked into the living room wearing the thin silk robe that showed the suggestion of the lingerie underneath, but wasn't explicitly revealing. A compromise between modesty in front of James's friend and creating the atmosphere I'd intended for the evening. "Can I get anyone anything?" I asked, trying to sound casual and welcoming despite my internal frustration about the extended visit. "More beer? Snacks? Anything?" James barely looked up from his conversation with Marcus. "We're good," he said dismissively, his attention remaining on whatever story Marcus was telling about a difficult client, not even glancing at me long enough to register what I was wearing or that there might be anything different about my appearance. The casual dismissal stung. I'd put effort into looking attractive and seductive, and James hadn't even looked at me long enough to notice, had treated my appearance as interruption to his conversation, rather than as something worth acknowledging. But Marcus looked. Not a quick glance and return to conversation, but a sustained look that took in the robe, the suggestion of lace underneath, my effort at appearance. His eyes widened slightly, his conversation faltered mid-sentence, and there was a moment, probably only a few seconds but feeling much longer, where Marcus was clearly registering me as a woman, as attractive, as someone who'd made effort with appearance in ways that James hadn't even noticed. Then Marcus did something that was both appropriate and devastating. He looked away quickly, finished his beer in a long swallow, and stood up abruptly. "I should get going," he said, his voice slightly strained. "It's getting late, and you guys probably have plans for your evening." He was looking at James, not at me, giving his friend an out, signaling that maybe James should pay attention to his wife, who was clearly dressed for something more intimate than hosting house guests. "Already?" James said, sounding disappointed. "We were just getting into the discussion about the merger. You don't have to leave so early." James still hadn't looked at me, hadn't registered the signals both I and Marcus were giving that perhaps continuing this conversation wasn't the most important thing happening in the moment. "No, really, I should go," Marcus insisted, moving toward the door. As he passed me on his way out, he made brief eye contact, and in his expression I saw something that was complicated. Discomfort about the situation, recognition that he'd been put in an awkward position, but also something else. Awareness, appreciation, the look of someone who'd seen something beautiful and was trying to be respectful about not staring, but who couldn't help registering what he'd seen. After Marcus left, I stood in the living room in my robe, while James immediately picked up his phone and started scrolling through email, the moment passing without acknowledgement. "Are you coming to bed?" I asked finally, my voice carrying an edge that should have signaled something was wrong, even if James was too oblivious to notice my appearance. "In a bit," James said absently. "I need to respond to a few emails. You go ahead." He still hadn't looked at me, hadn't seen the effort I'd made, hadn't recognized that his friend had just fled our house in discomfort because he'd noticed what James was missing. I stood there for another moment, waiting for James to look up, to see me, to say anything that acknowledged I existed as more than just background presence in his life. But he just kept scrolling through his phone, completely unaware or uncaring that his wife was standing in their living room in expensive lingerie, trying desperately to get his attention. I went back to our bedroom and took off the lingerie, put on regular pajamas, got into bed alone. James came to bed eventually, kissed me perfunctorily on the forehead without really looking at me, went to sleep immediately. The expensive red lace stayed in my drawer, unworn and unseen, a symbol of rejection that was somehow worse than if James had explicitly said he wasn't interested. At least explicit rejection would have been a response, an acknowledgement that I'd tried something. What I got instead was nothing, complete obliviousness that I'd made any effort at all, total absence of recognition that anything unusual had happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's reaction. Not because I was attracted to Marcus or wanted anything to happen with him, I didn't, but because his response had made visible something I'd been refusing to fully acknowledge. I had become completely invisible to my husband, so invisible that I could dress in lingerie designed to seduce, and James literally didn't notice. But I wasn't invisible to everyone. Marcus had noticed immediately, had responded with the kind of awareness and appreciation that should have come from James, had recognized that I'd made effort and looked attractive in ways my own husband couldn't be bothered to observe. The disparity was devastating. If no one had noticed my effort, I could have told myself the lingerie was too subtle, or I'd chosen a bad moment, or any number of explanations that didn't require facing how invisible I'd become to James. But having someone else notice while James remained oblivious made the disconnection undeniable. It forced me to confront that the problem wasn't just circumstances or timing or stress. It was that James had fundamentally stopped seeing me as a person to be desired or even acknowledged, had reduced me to functional role in his life that required no attention or appreciation. The next day, I tried to talk to James about what had happened, though I wasn't sure how to articulate the complicated emotions the evening had triggered. "Did you notice anything different about last night?" I asked carefully, giving him opportunity to acknowledge that maybe he'd missed something, maybe he'd been distracted, but had registered on some level that I'd been trying to create a moment between us. "Last night?" James looked genuinely confused. "When Marcus was over?" "No, why? Did something happen?" His complete lack of awareness was almost impressive in its totality. He truly hadn't noticed the lingerie, the robe, the effort, Marcus's abrupt departure. None of it had registered as unusual or worth noting. I'd been invisible to him so completely that even when I'd actively tried to be seen, even when his friend had obviously noticed something, James had observed nothing. "I was wearing lingerie under my robe," I said bluntly, tired of being subtle or giving James chances to figure things out on his own. I'd bought expensive lingerie and was planning a romantic evening once Marcus left. I came out to the living room hoping you'd notice and maybe encourage Marcus to leave, but you didn't even look at me. You didn't see the lingerie, didn't register that I'd made any effort, didn't notice anything at all. James looked uncomfortable, defensive. "I was having a conversation with Marcus. I wasn't expecting you to be dressed up or planning something. If you wanted my attention, you should have said something instead of expecting me to read your mind." His response blamed me for his obliviousness, framed my effort as manipulative test rather than as genuine attempt to reconnect that he'd completely missed. "I shouldn't have to announce in front of your friend that I'm wearing lingerie for you later," I said, frustration bleeding into my voice. "You should have noticed your wife making an obvious effort at looking attractive. You should have looked at me for more than half a second and registered that something was different." Marcus noticed immediately, was so uncomfortable that he made an excuse to leave early to give us privacy. But you were completely oblivious. The mention of Marcus noticing changed James's expression from defensive to something uglier, jealousy mixed with anger. "Marcus noticed? What the hell does that mean? Were you showing off for Marcus? Is that what this is about?" The accusation was absurd and offensive, turning my pain about being invisible to my husband into accusation of inappropriate behavior with his friend. "I wasn't showing off for anyone," I said firmly. "I was trying to get my husband's attention, trying to create a moment of intimacy and connection in a marriage that's been dead for months. Marcus noticed because he actually looked at me, because he's capable of registering when a woman has made effort with her appearance. And his reaction, leaving immediately to give us privacy, showed more awareness and respect for our marriage than you've shown in months of ignoring me." James and I fought for the first time in years that morning. Actual raised voices and expressed frustrations, rather than the careful, polite distance that had characterized our recent relationship. I told James I felt invisible and neglected, that our marriage had become just logistics and cohabitation without any real intimacy or connection. James said I was being unfair, that he worked hard to provide for us, that my expectations for constant attention and romance were unrealistic for a long-term marriage, that the lingerie incident was me creating drama where none existed. "This isn't about constant attention," I said, my voice breaking. "This is about any attention. This is about you being so checked out of our marriage that I can walk through our living room in lingerie and you literally don't notice. This is about your friend being more aware of your wife's existence than you are. This is about me feeling completely alone in a marriage where I'm supposed to be your partner." The fight didn't resolve anything. James maintained that I was overreacting and creating problems where none existed. I maintained that his obliviousness was symptom of deeper disconnection that we needed to address. Eventually, we stopped talking, retreated to separate spaces in our house, avoided each other for the rest of the weekend in uncomfortable silence that was somehow worse than the fighting. What happened next was unexpected and made an already complicated situation even more difficult. Marcus called me on Monday afternoon, saying he needed to talk to me about something important, asking if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, curious and slightly apprehensive about what Marcus wanted to discuss. We met at a coffee shop near my office that afternoon, and after awkward initial pleasantries, Marcus got to the point. "I need to apologize for Friday night," he said, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I shouldn't have reacted the way I did when you came into the living room. I should have kept my attention on my conversation with James instead of noticing what I noticed. And I definitely shouldn't have made it obvious that I'd noticed by leaving abruptly. I put you in an awkward position, and I'm sorry." His apology was considerate and appropriate, taking responsibility for his reaction in ways that acknowledged the discomfort of the situation. But it also forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding. Marcus's noticing hadn't just been about me feeling seen. It had also been about Marcus responding to me as attractive woman in ways that had crossed boundaries of appropriate friend-spouse interaction, however briefly and however unintentionally. "You didn't do anything wrong," I said carefully. "You realized the situation was probably intimate or private, and removed yourself respectfully. That's exactly the right response. The problem isn't that you noticed. The problem is that James didn't notice, that my own husband is so disconnected from me that he couldn't register what was obvious to you within seconds." Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing whether to say something he was considering. "Can I be honest about something?" he asked finally. "And please understand this is coming from a place of caring about both of you as friends, not from any inappropriate interest or intention." I nodded, bracing for whatever Marcus was about to say. "James talks about you like you're his business partner or his roommate," Marcus said bluntly. "When he mentions you, it's about logistics, who's handling which household task, what your career plans are, practical matters. He never talks about you the way men talk about partners they're actually in love with. He doesn't mention missing you when you're traveling for work, doesn't bring up funny things you said or experiences you shared, doesn't seem to think about you as a person beyond your functional role in his life. And Friday night, when you walked into the room looking the way you looked and he didn't even glance up, it was honestly shocking to me. I couldn't understand how he could have someone like you and just not see you." Marcus's observation confirmed what I'd been feeling, but had been trying not to fully acknowledge. James had reduced me to functional role, had stopped thinking about or treating me as someone to be desired or emotionally engaged with, had become so comfortable with my presence that he'd stopped actually seeing me as a person at all. And Marcus, as an outside observer, could see what I'd been living with but not wanting to name. "I don't know what to do with that information," I admitted. "I've tried talking to James about our disconnection. I've suggested counseling. I've made efforts like Friday night to create opportunities for intimacy. Nothing works because James doesn't think there's a problem. He thinks I'm being dramatic or demanding, thinks this is just how long-term marriages are, thinks I should accept being treated as functional partner instead of as someone to be desired and appreciated." "You deserve better than that," Marcus said simply. "You deserve someone who sees you, who appreciates you, who notices when you make effort, and who values what you bring to their life beyond practical utility. James is my friend, and I care about him, but he's taking you completely for granted in ways that are honestly hard to watch." The conversation with Marcus was both validating and disturbing. Validating because he confirmed that my perception of being invisible to James wasn't imagined or exaggerated. It was obvious even to outside observers. Disturbing because having this conversation with James's friend felt like betrayal of my marriage, even though nothing inappropriate was happening. Felt like I was seeking validation from someone other than my husband in ways that highlighted how broken my marriage had become. After coffee with Marcus, I went home and told James we needed to see a marriage counselor, that I was serious about this being non-negotiable. "Either we get professional help to address the disconnection in our marriage, or I want to separate because I can't continue living like this," I said firmly. James agreed to counseling with visible reluctance, clearly viewing it as box to check to satisfy my demands rather than as genuine opportunity to improve our relationship. The marriage counseling revealed patterns that our therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, identified as emotionally neglectful relationship dynamics. Dr. Kim explained that James had essentially created a marriage where I served functional purposes, managing household tasks, providing social partnership, maintaining appearances of successful marriage, but where he'd completely withdrawn emotional and physical intimacy. Claire has become the manager of James's domestic life, Dr. Kim explained, but not a person he's actually in relationship with in any meaningful emotional or sexual sense. When Dr. Kim asked James directly what he valued about being married to me beyond practical benefits, James struggled to answer. He eventually said things like, "She's responsible," and "She's good at managing our household," and "We have similar career goals." All functional assessments that said nothing about me as a person he loved or desired or wanted to be close to. He couldn't articulate emotional or physical needs that I specifically met, couldn't identify ways that being married to me enhanced his life beyond practical convenience. Dr. Kim also addressed the lingerie incident directly, using it as example of how disconnected James had become. When your wife wore lingerie designed to get your attention, and you literally didn't notice, that wasn't just about being distracted by a conversation, Dr. Kim explained to James. That was about having become so completely disconnected from Claire as a sexual and romantic partner that even explicit invitations to intimacy don't register as relevant to you. You've trained yourself not to see her in those ways anymore, and that training is so complete that she's become invisible even when actively trying to be seen. Confronted with this analysis, James initially defended himself. He was stressed at work, he was tired. His lack of noticing didn't mean he didn't care. But Dr. Kim pushed him to examine whether his explanations were actually true or whether they were rationalizations for emotional withdrawal he didn't want to acknowledge. If you were truly just tired or distracted, Dr. Kim pointed out, you'd also be too tired for other activities. But you have energy for work, for socializing with friends, for pursuing hobbies. You're only too tired specifically for emotional and physical intimacy with Claire, which suggests the issue isn't exhaustion, but rather disconnection you're using tiredness to justify. Dr. Kim also addressed my mentioning that Marcus had noticed what James missed, exploring what that moment had meant, and whether it had created inappropriate dynamics that needed to be acknowledged. I explained honestly that Marcus's noticing hadn't created attraction or interest in him. It had created painful awareness of how invisible I'd become to my own husband, had forced me to confront that the problem wasn't me being undesirable, but James being completely checked out of our marriage. The danger in that moment, Dr. Kim explained, wasn't that Marcus noticed or that Claire felt seen by someone other than her husband. The danger was that feeling invisible in your marriage makes you vulnerable to connections that provide the attention and validation your spouse isn't providing. Claire appropriately recognized that Marcus's attention was about her being seen, not about Marcus being the right person to see her. But that recognition required conscious resistance to using external validation as substitute for fixing the actual problem, which is James's emotional absence from the marriage. James and I continued counseling for about 4 months, during which James made some surface efforts to be more attentive. He'd schedule date nights, he'd compliment my appearance occasionally, he'd initiate sex sometimes instead of always waiting for me to initiate. But the efforts felt performative rather than genuine, felt like homework assignments from Dr. Kim rather than authentic desire to reconnect. The sex we had during this period was worse than no sex, mechanical and disconnected. Both of us going through motions because the therapist said intimacy was important, neither of us actually present or finding real pleasure or connection. What became increasingly clear through counseling was that James fundamentally didn't want to be emotionally or sexually intimate with me anymore. Not because of anything I'd done wrong, not because of fixable problems, but because he'd evolved into someone who didn't value or desire that kind of connection. He liked the practical partnership of our marriage, appreciated having reliable co-parent for our eventual children and professional partner who understood career demands. But actual intimacy, emotional vulnerability, physical desire, romantic connection, those things felt burdensome to James, obligations he resented rather than experiences he wanted. About 5 months after the lingerie incident that had started this whole process, I told James I wanted a divorce. Not because of Marcus or because of any specific dramatic event, but because months of therapy had made clear that James couldn't or wouldn't provide the kind of marriage I needed. The person who could walk through a room in red lace lingerie without his husband even glancing up deserved better than a marriage where she was invisible, deserved better than a partner who treated emotional connection as burdensome obligation. James accepted the divorce with what seemed like relief, sadness about failure of our marriage, but relief about not having to continue performing intimacy he didn't genuinely feel. We divorced relatively amicably, dividing assets fairly, going our separate ways without dramatic conflict or ongoing hostility. The process took about 8 months to finalize, and by the end we'd transitioned from married couple to cordial strangers who coordinated logistics efficiently, but who no longer had any real connection. The aftermath of the divorce forced me to examine my own role in having stayed in an emotionally neglectful marriage for as long as I did. Dr. Kim helped me understand that I'd been making excuses for James's disconnection, attributing distance to work stress or life circumstances rather than recognizing it was symptom of fundamental emotional withdrawal. I'd accepted his framing that my needs for intimacy and attention were unrealistic, rather than trusting my own assessment that being invisible in your own marriage is legitimately painful, regardless of what stage of relationship you're in. I also had to process the complicated feelings about Marcus's role in my recognition of how bad things had become. Marcus hadn't done anything wrong. He'd noticed something obvious, responded with appropriate discomfort and immediate departure, later apologized for any awkwardness he'd created, but his noticing had catalyzed my awareness of James's obliviousness in ways that changed everything, had made undeniable something I'd been able to rationalize when it was just between James and me. Marcus and I maintained cordial friendship after my divorce, though we were both careful about boundaries given the complicated history. He never expressed romantic interest or suggested that his noticing the lingerie had been about attraction to me specifically. It had just been human response to obvious effort and beauty that happened to occur at a moment when my husband's contrasting obliviousness was maximally painful and revealing. The friendship survived because both of us understood what that moment had and hadn't been, could acknowledge its significance without loading it with implications or possibilities that didn't actually exist. 2 years after the lingerie incident and 18 months after my divorce finalized, I'm 36 and rebuilt into a life that's mine, rather than organized around an emotionally absent partner. I've dated some, casually, learning what it feels like to be seen and desired by people who actually pay attention when I walk into a room. I've invested in friendships and hobbies and professional development in ways I'd neglected while pouring energy into a marriage that wasn't reciprocating my efforts. I've learned that being alone is genuinely better than being lonely in a marriage, that feeling invisible to a partner is more isolating than actual solitude. James, from what I hear through mutual friends, is doing fine, focusing on his career, dating occasionally, seemingly untroubled by our divorce or by whatever dysfunction had characterized our final years of marriage. From the outside, his life probably looks successful and unimpacted by the failure of our relationship. And maybe that's accurate. Maybe James truly didn't notice or care about the distance between us. Maybe my invisibility to him was never painful from his perspective because he didn't want to see me anyway. What I know now is that the night I wore red lace panties and my husband didn't notice but his friend did wasn't really about either of those men. It was about my recognition that I deserved to be seen, that physical and emotional intimacy weren't unrealistic expectations, but basic relationship needs. That accepting invisibility because confronting it felt too scary or difficult was slow death of self. Marcus noticing what James missed didn't create the problem. It revealed a problem that had existed for much longer than I'd been willing to acknowledge. The lingerie stayed in my drawer for months after that night, unworn and forgotten, symbol of rejection and invisibility. Eventually I threw it away, not wanting physical reminder of that painful evening. But recently, I bought new lingerie, different style, different color, purchased not for anyone else but for myself, reminder that I deserve to feel attractive and valued regardless of whether anyone else is looking. Because the lesson of that night wasn't about who noticed me, it was about learning to notice myself, to value myself, to recognize when I was accepting treatment that diminished me, and to choose something better instead. My name is Claire Watson. I'm 36 years old and divorced from a man who stopped seeing me so completely that I could wear sexy lingerie and he literally didn't notice. His friend's discomfort and immediate departure should have been embarrassing, but instead it was revelation, showing me that invisibility to my husband wasn't about me being undesirable, but about him being completely checked out of our marriage. The recognition hurt. The divorce was difficult. But emerging from a relationship where I'd become invisible into a life where I'm actually present, that's been worth every uncomfortable moment of facing truths I'd spent months avoiding. Thank you for reading. If this story helped you recognize when you've become invisible in your own relationship, please like and subscribe. Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.